Okay, let's jump right into chapter 1. But before we do, let me just say that there are some slides that I've made available that accompany these lectures. And I encourage you to have read the chapter that we're dealing with, this chapter 1. And also you can follow along with the slides. They're the sort of highlights. They have images from your book and information that's provided that's sort of bullet points for what the most important things from that chapter are. I also mentioned in the introductory video that that precedes this, I mentioned that I feel that my role is as a guide. This book, while well written, is dense. There's a lot of information in it, and it may be difficult to extract the most important, meaningful things from it. So that's really where I come in to try and distill some of this information in a way that's a little bit more manageable and easier for you to digest. Once again, this course is on anthropology, and it's Anthropology 102, Introduction to Physical Anthropology. I mentioned in the introductory video that there are 4 fields of anthropology, but ultimately the question of anthropology is one question. And so while there are 4 disciplines, which we'll discuss in a little greater detail in this video, what anthropology is about is the study of humans, and in all of their wide diversity and deep complexity. So that's a difficult question to approach. You're perfectly qualified to answer these questions. You are a human. And if I were to ask you, who are you? How would you answer? How would you even begin to answer that question? You could go to a philosophy class and talk about existence and talk about consciousness, and you could go to a theology class and talk about the soul and morality and these sorts of things. But this is a science class, and anthropology is ultimately trying to deal with objective facts and try and come up with some of the best explanations for what a human is and how to explain some of our diversity. Everything about humans can be looked at from an anthropological perspective. And because that question is so huge, if I were to just ask you, okay, explain what a human is, you might say, well, a human is an animal. And that is true, right? Humans are animals. We have physical bodies, we're organisms, we have all these organs and functions and these sorts of things that every other animal has. And we can compare ourselves. That's a true statement, but is that enough? Is that enough to really explain what a human is, or what you are? No, probably not. That's not satisfying. So while physical anthropology is a scientific process that we apply to trying to understand the physical nature of humans as biological beings, does that answer every question that we have about humans? Of course not. That's why these 4 fields articulate to one another. And in fact, if there's one thing that this book, Our Origins, is weakest at, like I said, I think it's a terrific book, but if there's one thing that it's weakest at, is the fact that we are not just biological beings, we are also cultural beings. Now, the book does go into some of these details, and I want to actually highlight some of those, that confluence of cultural anthropology and physical anthropology today in this lecture. We'll talk about that more as time goes on as well. But it's not just enough to say, I'm an animal, okay, that's what a human is. Is that satisfying to you? No. We have thoughts, we have feelings, we have culture. I'm wearing a shirt, I've got books behind me. These are all aspects of being a human as well. And those can't just be understood in terms of biology. Those have something that goes a little bit beyond that, and we need some other tools to be able to understand those anthropological facts as well. So physical anthropology is one aspect of this big question of what humans are and how do we explain that. We also want to know, why are we different? How are we different? I'm made up of atoms, right? And every creature on this earth is made up of very similar atoms. And what makes me different, my configuration of atoms, different from another creature's configuration? So why are humans so different from other animals? Are we? Are we on the continuum? Is it just sort of one of scale rather than kind differences? And also we need to establish, if we're going to ask these questions about humans, about the physical world, we need to have some procedures to do that. Scientific procedures that treat things as objectively as possible, that do away with some of our own biases that may take us down paths that aren't lead us to the wrong conclusions. So in other words, how do physical anthropologists know what they know? How do we arrive at scientific conclusions? So you need to start thinking like a scientist, and not just making assumptions, but also trying to gather details. And that's what this book is full of, is lots of details, and then be able to assess these conclusions based on evidence. Now, because this is an introductory class, you're not expected to go out and find new evidence. And there will have to be a little bit of acceptance that the evidence that's presented to you in this book is true, and I can verify that it is. Is it the complete picture? No. Actually, you will find news stories probably throughout this course of new discoveries and new interpretations from physical anthropologists that slightly alter the way that we look at our past and who we are evolutionarily and today. So will we ever have the full picture? No. But our picture gets better and better and better through time. That's the way the scientific process works. Anthropology, being the study of humankind, is not just in the past either. It's also in the present. Actually, some of the best data that we have to work with is from present-day humans. But why don't we have things like wings? Wouldn't that be great if you had wings? Or you could see in the dark? Or you could run super fast? Or maybe you had claws or fangs? Some of these things would be terrific. Or, scaly armor, or you could swim breathe underwater. These are all terrific things, right? It would be great to have these superpowers, right? But we don't. Why is that? Well, because natural selection has selected particular forms for us. And we have some pretty cool things about us too. For one thing, we've got some really big brains, bigger than most animals, and proportional to our bodies, really big. We're smart. We use those brains in a particular way. We also have certain features that you may not think about as being really good at things, but we've got two forward-facing eyes. What's that for? Why don't we have eyes on the side of our heads like a cow that you could actually see in all the way around you? Wouldn't that be good? Well, why are our eyes facing forward? Why do we stand up? What other animals walk on 2 feet? Well, we'll look at the reasons for that. We have a evolutionary biological past that leads us to our present. And understanding humans takes many specialists and a lot of science to try and come to the answers about why we are the way we are. And so we have to view humankind as a sort of a big picture thing. That is to say that I am not just a living creature right now. I am the product of millions and millions of years of evolution that have come to this point. And evolution hasn't ended with me. Evolution is going to continue into the future. Humans won't look like the way we do today in the future. We're changing through evolution as we speak. So to understand humans, we need to be able to approach this evidence in a way that you can organize this data. And no one person can know everything about humans. We just do too good of a job today that we understand medicine, we understand culture, we understand languages, we understand the past. All of these things are different aspects of evidence that we can use to understand ourselves. And because we do such a good job of it, no one person can be a specialist, an expert in every single aspect of what it is to be a human. So in America, in North America, there's a sort of a founding father of anthropology named Franz Boas. And Franz Boas was a Columbia University professor, trained a whole generation of very influential anthropologists, some of whom names you might even be familiar with, like Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. And he was coming out of a tradition in the late 19th century that treated anthropology in very nebulous terms. It was not very fact-based. It was more of a cultural history or art historical or that sort of a thing that didn't really apply science to trying to understanding humans. And Franz Boas rejected this non-scientific approach, and we now have these four fields of anthropology in North America. It's a little different in other countries, but in America and Canada, anthropology is broken down into four fields that Franz Boas really emphasized was an important way to chop up the subject matter into manageable chunks. And those four fields, as I've mentioned before, are cultural anthropology, archaeology, physical or biological anthropology, which is what we're focusing on in this class, and linguistic anthropology. And each of these fields are talking about what humans are. So they're all looking at the same subject matter from slightly different angles. So they're not talking about different things, they're just different approaches to look at the same thing. That is to say, what is a human and what can we say about them? So these four branches of anthropology people focus on. My background is I'm an archaeologist. I'm the person who goes out and finds the traces of human behavior and human activity from the past. I excavate it, I interpret it. 100 years from now, people are going to look at my interpretations and they'll think, Andrew McCarthy, he didn't know what he was talking about. We totally reject his interpretations, and I'm totally comfortable with that because that's the way science works. I am making statements based on the facts that I have, and my theories, my hypotheses will be tested over and over and over again. Some of them will be accepted, some of them will be rejected. But what I hope will be the case 100 years from now is that even if they reject my interpretations, the facts that I've excavated from the ground will still be there for people to interpret in the future. So there's a difference between facts and interpretations. And we're going to talk a little bit about the way the scientific process goes through this and creates hypotheses, tests them, and then forms theories on top of that. And in order to understand humans, like I said, we're not just one-trick pony. We are not just biological beings, so physical anthropology may be our focus here, but we can't forget that we're more than that. We are cultural beings, we have a past, and we communicate to create that culture, and we have biological features as well. All of these different aspects of anthropology have to come together for us to understand the whole picture of what a human is. It's very difficult to parse these out, to take these treat these separately. And in fact, because no anthropologist is an expert in all four branches of anthropology, we anthropologists use each other's talents and abilities to create collaborative efforts. And so if a physical anthropologist tends to rely on cultural anthropologists to fill in some of the details. And physical anthropologists who study human evolution rely on archaeologists to do their work, to be able to provide them with the raw data that they can use for their interpretations in the physical realm as well. So the biocultural approach is actually an acknowledgement that humans are both cultural and biological beings. And the biocultural approach establishes that humans are the result of a combination of both inherited traits, that is to say, biological traits that you get from your parents and their parents and so on and so forth, and learned traits, ones that are part of your culture. And this shouldn't be such a surprise to you, really. And it's not that we are the only creatures on the planet that have both biological and learned traits, right? A fish, for instance, right? A fish isn't going to be around for very long if it doesn't know how to school. If it doesn't gather in its school of fish, it's going to be easily picked off by that dolphin who'll come and eat it. Now, that's a learned trait. There may be something biological about an instinct to school or to flock as birds, or to behave in certain ways. But these are also things that can be picked up by observation and participation in the real world. So while we're going to be looking at the biology, we also have to consider that our biological foundation, our bodies, are being used by ourselves, by our brains, to do things in the real world, and that's when it becomes a cultural trait. And you can't really separate those out from one another. They go hand in hand. Like I said, I think if there's this is a very good book, but if there's one thing that this book doesn't do as well as I would have liked, it's actually establishing that relationship between biological and cultural. But we're going to do that ourselves. And in fact, the essay that I'll set for you is going to specifically deal with that dichotomy between biological and cultural traits that humans have and how that relates to our evolutionary history. So that's something that, because I think this book could do a little more in that respect, we're going to do that on our own. I'll come back and tell you more about the essay at another time. So even within physical anthropology, that's too big of a subject for someone to be an expert in all aspects of physical anthropology. So there's 4 subfields. What are those again? Go through them in your brain. Cultural, archaeology, physical or biological anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. But even within physical anthropology, there are different aspects and that specialists will focus on. And this is partly because there's gaps in our knowledge and needs to be done, but also people have different interests. So some physical anthropologists like to compare us to some of our closest relatives in the animal kingdom, the primates. We are primates. You don't think for a moment that you're not part of the animal kingdom. You are. And we are primates, just like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, siamangs. We are primates. And we share biological features with those primates. And we'll see how that came to be and what the meaning of that is. Some physical anthropologists really like to study other living primates to see how we're different and how they behave in certain circumstances and what that can tell us about our own nature. So primatologists are one sub-branch of physical anthropology. Also looking at our bodies, our bones in particular. And these are things that are usually preserved better than most other parts from the past. So deceased, formerly living humans, what can you get out of them? Well, most of the soft tissue, once you die, decomposes, but the bones might be a little bit more resilient. And if we can find those bones from the past, we can tell a little bit about what our ancestors were like. And importantly, you have to understand the way bones function in a living organism to understand how they functioned in a past organism, especially when we're talking about changing biology. Do you think that we are exactly the same as our ancestors were a million years ago? We'll see, no, that's not the case. So, what has changed? Why has it changed? Also, physical anthropologists do things that are useful for today. They can apply this knowledge to things like forensics. Forensics is the word forensic simply means for use in a courtroom setting. So I'm an archaeologist, and I usually do research archaeology. I don't typically apply my what I find to a courtroom setting. But the data that I get for research purposes is just data. And they are just data. And if it was necessary to use what I found in archaeological excavations for a court case, I would have to prepare that in a forensic manner. And so forensic anthropologists just do what they do, and they apply that knowledge to real life situations like murder cases or things like that. But you can also go way, way back in time to look at our evolutionary history. And the word paleo is a Greek word meaning very old. And so paleoanthropology just means the looking at very old humans or human ancestors. And that sort of defines the whole look at the evolutionary history of humans, paleoanthropology. But we can also apply things not just to the past, but also how do humans differ today? Are we all the same? And if we're not, then where do these differences come from? How do those arise? And two aspects of our biological nature are really important to understand in respect to human variation and adaptations. And that is to say that we inherit things from our parents and their parents, but we also grow and develop and in a real world